Daniel Defoe, a journalist by trade and author of Robinson Crusoe, originally published A Journal of the Plague Year in 1722. The document itself purports to be a first-hand account of the Great Plague of 1665, during which 15% of London's population perished. Given Defoe's birth in 1660, the document is somewhat apocryphal and likely based on the lived experiences of Defoe's family. Despite this, there's much to be gleaned from the document, particularly in the ways in which different groups of people responded to the plague sweeping through their city. Much can also be inferred in how the document influenced future readers and how it impacted their attitudes and policies. Overall, the document is a valuable primary source, though it is somewhat suspect. As evidenced by Defoe's writing itself, the mid-17th century was a period of stark turmoil for England, not merely due to the plague that killed upwards of 100,000 people. The English Civil War had only officially ended 5 years previously with the downfall of Puritan rule and the end of the Commonwealth. Before the removal of the Puritans, the war itself had raged from 1642 to 1651, coming to a climax with the public execution of King Charles I. Not only was the Civil War a political contest, it was deeply steeped in religious disagreement between Catholics, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Calvinists, and other denominations. Britain was not alone in this religious turmoil. The 16th and 17th centuries saw Europe plunged into a series of religious wars, the worst of which being the 30 Years' War. This turmoil can be seen in Defoe's own commentary, particularly when he harshly criticizes the royal court for fleeing London at the height of the plague. Quote, "The court removed early and went to Oxford, where it pleased God to preserve them, for which I cannot say that I ever saw they showed any great token of thankfulness." Unquote. Defoe himself being a nonconformist, and in stark disagreement with the Church of England, was likely already opposed to Charles II long before the plague. On the next page, Defoe discusses how the royal court before the plague, quote, "brought with them a great flux of pride and new fashions. All people were grown gay and luxurious, and the joy of the Restoration had brought a vast many families to London." Unquote. There is an implication of decadence directly connected to the king and his court. It is telling that Defoe would take time in his account to publicly and harshly criticize a king that many others viewed positively. It is Defoe's particular religious disposition that informs much of his account. Decades of instability and strife, largely due to religious conflict, culminating in the Great Plague, must have seemed like punishment from God himself. Defoe expresses this often throughout his account. Defoe notes how, quote, "a blazing star or comet appeared several months before the plague," unquote, and that it, quote, "foretold a heavy judgment, slow but severe, terrible and frightful, as was the plague," unquote. This sense of judgment from God fits well with Defoe's predilections, particularly given his opposition to the king and the Church of England. Defoe quotes the book of Jeremiah, quote, "Shall I not visit for these things, saith the Lord? And shall not my soul be avenged of such a nation as this?" Unquote. Defoe himself believes that he was being protected by God from the plague. Even if Defoe himself did not believe the plague was a punishment from God, Defoe relates how many others certainly believed it was. Defoe describes how a naked man ran through the streets yelling, quote, "Oh, the great and dreadful God," unquote. This idea of God's wrath is also connected to Defoe's use of the term visitation throughout the text. While Defoe is largely dismissive of a possession causing the disease, the use of this term largely has a spiritual connotation. Furthermore, Defoe's account largely reflects the beliefs of his time, particularly around the causes and the spread of sickness. Primarily, this is seen in the use of the term distemper, which Defoe uses 151 separate times to describe the illness. According to Merriam-Webster, a distemper is, quote, 1. Bad humor or bad temper. 2. A disordered or abnormal bodily state, unquote. The use of this term to describe the disease sweeping the city is directly connected to the concept of humorism that was dominant in European medicine for centuries. Defoe's account of the plague was widely read well into the 19th century, and a reader from that time could find much to work with depending upon their predilections. Much of what a 19th century reader might glean is focused on what measures should and should not be taken in combating an epidemic. Defoe quotes Lord Mayor Lawrence's pronouncement of policies in its entirety. These orders included establishing examiners in every parish to investigate claims of sickness, which was to be centrally coordinated by the examiner's office. People found to be ill were to have their homes boarded up with them inside, with anyone else who was unfortunate to be with them at the time. Watchmen were to be set out to watch every house boarded up this way. Such houses were to be marked with a cross and the words, quote, Lord, have mercy upon us, unquote. Doctors and nurses were to be sent in, as need be, to help the sick in whatever way they could. When a person perished, their body was to be carted away quickly to be buried at least 6 feet deep. Family and friends were not permitted to attend the funeral. To that end, so many were dying that mass graves replaced individual graves. Movement was to be restricted. To leave the city, one needed a certificate of health from the Lord Mayor's office. Movement within the city was also to be regulated, particularly with, quote, rogues and wandering beggars that swarm in every place about the city, being a great cause of the spreading of the infection, unquote. All public gatherings, particularly plays, public feasts, taverns, bear baitings, and other forms of entertainment, were shut down. The College of Physicians was also ordered to publish, quote, directions for cheap remedies for the poor. While Defoe is quite positive towards the Lord Mayor and his policies, he was certainly troubled by the policy of boarding up the sick in their houses, locking them away, essentially to die alone. Quote, this shutting up of houses was at first counted a very cruel and unchristian method, and the poor people so confined made bitter lamentations, unquote. Defoe throughout the document seems to be conflicted on the policy. He sympathizes with the people so locked away, and those who tried to escape their own homes. Yet he also sees the necessity to stop the spread. Very likely, 19th century policymakers would replicate these policies to contain other epidemics, particularly considering that the Great Plague burned itself out rather quickly. Outside of the context of disease, other 19th century readers could use the document in a multitude of ways. For instance, a Marxist could find much to work with, particularly in the development of the bourgeoisie and its interaction with other classes. Though Defoe is sympathetic to the plight of the working class, he nevertheless expresses this concern in a form of middle-class paternalism. Throughout, Defoe makes note of how the poor were easily duped and deceived by astrologers, fortune-tellers, and doctors giving quack remedies. Defoe portrays the poor as being superstitious, believing in ghosts and signs. Defoe is expressing a common Enlightenment contempt for superstition and assigning them to the working class, his own religious beliefs aside. Furthermore, Defoe is expressing his contempt for the royal court, is partly demonstrating the conflict between the emerging bourgeoisie and the ancien regime. All of this would fit into a Marxist conception of a class conflict and dialectic. Other readers, particularly Orientalist scholars, could use this as a primary source to confirm their own narratives about the Orient and the Oriental mind. Defoe relates what his brother had told him of the Levant, and how, quote, the Turks and the Mahometans in Asia, presuming their own professed predestinating notions, would go into infected places and converse with infected persons, by which means they died at the rate of 10 or 15,000 a week, whereas the Europeans or Christian merchants who kept themselves retired and reserved generally escaped the contagion, unquote. The Orientals were superstitious and walked into danger despite what the evidence told them. Meanwhile, the Occidentals, aided by science and reason, remained safe. This would fit well into various Orientalist narratives that propagated throughout the 19th century. It is difficult to say whether London was resilient. Namely, it begs the question of what is considered London. The Great Plague largely began in the poorer areas of the town and swept through areas that were considered suburbs. When Defoe refers to the city, he is often referring to the wealthier parts of town and where he himself lived. Furthermore, there is a sense of class distinction insofar as upwards of 200,000 people fled the city at the beginning of the outbreak. Most were wealthy. By Defoe's account, there appeared to be multiple Londons, largely based upon one's wealth. Which London was resilient? What could be said is that London was not completely abandoned, that many brave people did their best to fight the disease, the panic, and the misinformation, that many ministers, watchmen, doctors, and nurses died by doing their duty. For these people, Defoe is thankful. Further, London remained, and once the disease died down, quote, a great number of people immediately appeared in the city, unquote. People returned, and civil life went on as normal, though the scars and memories of the plague remained. What could also be said is that Defoe, as he portrays himself, remained resilient. His faith did not flag, and he survived where thousands did not. Defoe ends his journal with a poem from his own pen. A dreadful plague in London was, in the year 65, where swept 100,000 souls away, yet I, alive.